The first thing John noticed was the silence. It was oppressive, a thick, suffocating absence of sound that seemed to press down on him from all sides. For a moment, he wasn't sure if he was even alive. His body felt heavy, unnaturally so, as if the air around him had been replaced with a viscous, invisible sludge. Slowly, the feeling returned to his limbs, and with it, the first tingling edges of fear. He opened his eyes. Darkness. An endless, inky blackness stretched before him in all directions, swallowing everything. He blinked, hoping his vision would adjust, but it didn't. His heart began to pound, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness. As he sat up, the texture beneath his hands registered, cold, rough stone, damp and uneven. It was like lying on the bedrock of a long-forgotten cave. But it wasn't a cave. The air was too thick, too hot. His skin prickled with a heat that seemed to come from within the very stone, radiating upwards in slow, painful waves. Then, far in the distance, a dull red glow appeared. It was barely a pinprick of light, but in the overwhelming blackness, it stood out like a beacon. John's breath caught in his throat as he scrambled to his feet, his shoes scraping against the stone, sending a cascade of tiny pebbles tumbling into the void. He wasn't alone, he could feel it. Something was watching him from within that glow. He hesitated, his mind reeling with disjointed memories. An accident, the screech of tires, a flash of pain. And then nothing. Where was he? His body ached, as if he had been crushed under an immense weight. He took a step toward the glow, and then another, drawn toward it despite the gnawing fear in his gut. The glow grew larger as he approached, revealing the vague outlines of jagged rocks and twisted formations. The terrain was treacherous, the stone beneath his feet brittle and sharp. He stumbled, almost falling, and his hand shot out to catch himself on a nearby rock. The surface was warm to the touch, and as he withdrew his hand, he noticed it was covered in a thin film of dark, viscous liquid. Blood. A deep guttural groan echoed through the darkness, reverberating off the stone walls. John froze, every muscle in his body tensing. The sound was unlike anything he had ever heard, a low, mournful wail that seemed to vibrate through the very air, raising the hairs on the back of his neck. It was the sound of something ancient, something tortured. The glow ahead flickered, growing brighter, revealing more of the surrounding landscape. The ground sloped downward into a vast, jagged valley. The rocks and cliffs twisted into impossible shapes. Pools of molten lava bubbled and spat, casting a sickly orange light across the landscape. The sky, or whatever passed for it, was a swirling mass of dark clouds, shot through with veins of crimson lightning that crackled and writhed like living things. John's heart pounded in his chest as he descended into the valley. The heat intensified with every step, sweat pouring down his face in rivulets. The air was thick with the stench of sulfur and charred flesh, a nauseating mixture that made his stomach churn. As he reached the valley floor, the ground beneath him began to tremble. He staggered, barely keeping his balance, and looked around wildly. It was then that he saw them. Silhouetted against the fiery glow were figures, human shapes, but distorted, twisted. They writhed in agony, their bodies bound in chains that glowed with a dull red heat. Some were suspended from the jagged rocks, their limbs contorted into impossible angles, while others were forced to march in endless circles, their faces frozen in expressions of utter despair. A scream tore through the air, high-pitched and piercing, echoing across the valley. John turned toward the source and saw a figure standing at the edge of a pool of lava. Its skin was blistered and charred, flesh hanging in ragged strips from its bones. The figure clawed at its own face, trying in vain to escape the unbearable heat, but there was no escape. The lava bubbled and hissed, and with a final pitiful wail, the figure collapsed into the molten pool, vanishing beneath the surface. John stumbled backward, bile rising in his throat. He had to get out of here. Wherever here was, he couldn't stay, but as he turned to flee, he found the way blocked. Standing before him was a massive figure, easily twice his height, its body a twisted mass of sinew and muscle. Its skin was a deep, sickly green, mottled with patches of red and black. Its eyes glowed with a malevolent light, and when it opened its mouth, rows of jagged yellow teeth were revealed. The creature spoke, its voice a deep, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate through John's very bones. "Welcome, sinner," it hissed, the words dripping with venom. You have entered the domain of the damned. There is no escape, no salvation. You are ours for eternity." John stumbled backward, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His mind raced, but no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't think of anything he had done to deserve this. What had he done to be condemned to this hellish place? "Why?" he managed to croak, his voice barely audible over the roar of the flames. "Why am I here?" The creature laughed, a low, guttural sound that sent shivers down his spine. "You know why." It snarled, taking a step forward. The ground shook beneath its feet. "All who come here know. You have sinned, mortal, and now you will suffer for all eternity." John's legs gave out, and he collapsed to the ground, the rough stone scraping his hands and knees. Desperation clawed at him, but no matter how hard he tried to remember, he couldn't recall what had led him to this place. The accident, the pain, nothing more. His thoughts were a jumbled mess, as if some part of him was refusing to acknowledge the truth. The creature loomed over him, its eyes burning with an unholy light. "It is time," it growled. "Your punishment awaits." Before John could react, the creature's massive hand shot out, wrapping around his torso like a vice. He was lifted off the ground, the air forced from his lungs by the sheer pressure of the creature's grip. He struggled, kicking and thrashing, but it was like fighting against a mountain. The creature carried him effortlessly across the valley, its long strides eating up the distance. As they moved deeper into the hellish landscape, the temperature continued to rise. The air was thick with the smell of sulfur and burning flesh, the heat searing his skin. The sounds of torment grew louder, screams, wails, and cries of agony echoing from every direction. The ground beneath them was a churning sea of lava, rivers of molten rock winding through the jagged terrain like fiery serpents. At last, they arrived at a massive iron gate set into the side of a mountain. The gate was adorned with grotesque carvings, twisted faces contorted in agony, their eyes hollow and empty. The creature stopped before the gate, and with a deep reverberating roar, it called out to the darkness beyond. The gate groaned as it slowly swung open, revealing a cavernous chamber filled with thick, choking smoke. The heat was unbearable, waves of it radiating from the glowing embers that lined the chamber walls. In the center of the chamber was a massive stone altar, and upon it lay a figure, writhing in agony. Chains bound the figure's limbs, glowing red-hot as they seared into the flesh. The creature carried John to the altar and threw him down beside it. The impact knocked the breath from his lungs, and he lay there gasping, his vision swimming. He looked up at the figure on the altar, and his heart froze. It was him. His own face, twisted in pain, stared back at him, eyes wide with terror. The realization hit him like a sledgehammer. He was already dead, and this was his eternity. There was no escape, no waking up from this nightmare. The creature loomed over him, its eyes glowing with a sadistic pleasure. "Your suffering begins now," it growled, raising one massive clawed hand. John tried to scream, but no sound came out. The creature's claws descended, and the last thing he saw was his own face, reflected in the molten metal of the chains. When he opened his eyes again, the silence returned, the oppressive, suffocating silence that seemed to press down on him from all sides. His body felt heavy, unnaturally so, as if the air around him had been replaced with a viscous, invisible sludge. Slowly the feeling returned to his limbs, and with it, the first tingling edges of fear. He opened his eyes. Darkness, an endless inky blackness stretched before him in all directions, swallowing everything. He blinked, hoping his vision would adjust, but it didn't. His heart began to pound, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness. As he sat up, the texture beneath his hands registered, cold, rough stone, damp and uneven. It was like lying on the bedrock of a long-forgotten cave. But again, it wasn't a cave. The air was too thick, too hot. His skin prickled with a heat that seemed to come from within the very stone, radiating upwards in slow, painful waves. A sense of déjà vu washed over him, chilling him despite the searing heat. He pushed himself up, his limbs trembling, and glanced around at the darkness. There was something eerily familiar about the rough, uneven stone beneath his hands, the oppressive silence, and the void that stretched out before him. It was as if he had been here before. Then, far in the distance, the same dull red glow appeared, piercing the blackness like a bloodshot eye. It was small, barely a pinprick, but in the overwhelming dark, it was unmistakable. John's heart sank. He knew what was coming, but his mind refused to fully grasp it. It was as if he was trapped in a loop, a sickening spiral from which there was no escape. "No," he whispered, his voice hoarse, cracking from the dryness in his throat. "No, this can't be happening." But it was happening, and deep down, he knew it. The ground beneath him trembled as he stumbled toward the red glow, his steps faltering and unsteady. The jagged rocks and twisted formations that had been revealed to him earlier by the glow now reappeared in the same dreadful sequence, like pieces of a puzzle snapping into place. Each step brought him closer to the valley, the descent into that nightmarish landscape that he had already experienced, yet could not escape. The same grotesque scene greeted him as he reached the valley floor, twisted figures in torment, chained to the rocks, suspended in endless agony. The air was thick with the smell of sulfur, the acrid stench of burning flesh. The lava pits bubbled and spat, casting their sickly light across the landscape. And once again, the high-pitched scream echoed across the valley, tearing through the silence like a blade. John's stomach lurched as he turned to face the source of the scream. The figure at the edge of the lava pool was there, just as before, its charred skin hanging in strips, its face contorted in a mask of unimaginable pain. It was the same scene, playing out exactly as it had before, and he could do nothing to stop it. The figure clawed at its face, then collapsed into the molten pool with a final despairing wail. John's knees buckled, and he collapsed onto the stone, his hands covering his ears in a futile attempt to block out the sound. It was too much, the horror of it all, the crushing realization that this was his reality now. He had been condemned to this nightmare, and there was no waking up, no escaping from the endless torment. He barely registered the creature's approach until it was towering over him once more. The massive figure, with its sinewy muscles, mottled skin, and glowing eyes, was a horrific sight. John knew what it would say, knew the words that would drip from its lips like venom, yet he couldn't bring himself to move, to fight, or even to scream. "Welcome, sinner," the creature hissed, just as it had before. "You have entered the domain of the damned. There is no escape, no salvation. You are ours for eternity." The words hit him like a sledgehammer, knocking the wind from his lungs. The creature's presence, its sheer malevolence, was overwhelming. John's body trembled as the creature's voice rumbled through the air, vibrating through his bones. "Why?" John managed to croak, his voice barely more than a whisper, choked with despair. "Why am I here? What did I do?" The creature's eyes gleamed with a sinister light, its jagged teeth bared in a cruel smile. "You know why," it growled, the words echoing in John's mind like a curse. "All who come here know. You have sinned, mortal, and now you will suffer for all eternity." "No," John whispered, shaking his head as he backed away, crawling on his hands and knees over the sharp, uneven stones. The pain barely registered as he moved, his mind too consumed with the horror of his situation. I don't remember what I did." The creature watched him with a mocking expression, its massive arms crossed over its broad chest. "Denial will not save you," it rumbled, taking a step closer. The ground trembled beneath its weight, sending small rocks tumbling down the valley slopes. "You cannot escape your guilt. It will follow you, hound you, until you accept the truth." John shook his head more violently, his heart hammering in his chest. "I don't remember," he screamed, his voice cracking with desperation. "I don't remember anything. What did I do? Why can't I remember?" The creature knelt down beside him, its foul breath hot against John's face as it leaned in close. "The mind protects itself," it said, its voice a low, sinister whisper. "The memory of your sin is too much for you to bear, but it will come back to you. In time, you cannot hide from it forever." With a sudden, bone-crushing grip, the creature seized John by the arm and hoisted him to his feet. John cried out in pain as the creature's claws dug into his flesh, the heat from its body scorching him. It dragged him across the valley, toward the same iron gate set into the mountain. "No, please, no," John begged, struggling against the creature's hold, but it was useless. The creature was too strong, and his resistance only seemed to amuse it. It laughed, a deep, rumbling sound that shook the very air around them. The gate groaned open as they approached, the same grotesque carvings leering down at him, their twisted faces frozen in expressions of eternal agony. Beyond the gate, the same cavernous chamber waited, filled with thick, choking smoke and lined with glowing embers that pulsed with a sickly light. As they entered the chamber, John's eyes were drawn to the stone altar at its center. His heart sank as he saw the figure writhing in agony upon it, bound in glowing red-hot chains. It was him, again, his own face staring back at him, twisted in pain and terror. The creature threw him down beside the altar, just as it had before. The impact knocked the breath from his lungs, and he lay there gasping, his vision swimming. He could feel the heat of the chains, hear the sizzle of flesh, and smell the acrid stench of burning skin. It was all happening again, just as before, but this time something was different. As he looked up at the figure on the altar, at himself, he felt a flicker of recognition, a small crack in the wall his mind had built around the truth. Memories began to surface, hazy and fragmented, but undeniable. The screech of tires, the blinding headlights, the sickening crunch of metal, and then the screams. His screams, her screams. "No," John whispered, his voice trembling as the memories came flooding back, a torrent of guilt and shame that threatened to drown him. "No, it wasn't my fault. It wasn't." But the truth was there, staring him in the face. The accident, the car swerving out of control, the innocent woman crossing the street, the moment of impact. The horror as he watched her body crumple under the force of the collision, the blood pooling on the asphalt, her eyes wide with fear and pain. The look on her face as she realized she was dying. John had killed her. The realization hit him like a physical blow, knocking the wind from his lungs, filling his chest with a crushing weight of guilt and despair. The creature's words echoed in his mind. You cannot escape your guilt. He couldn't run from it, couldn't hide. This was his sin, his crime, and he had to face it. The creature watched him, its cruel smile widening as it saw the truth dawn in his eyes. "You remember now, don't you?" it whispered, its voice filled with satisfaction. "You took a life, and now you will pay the price." John's body shook with sobs as the full weight of his guilt settled over him, crushing him under its immense pressure. He had killed an innocent woman, taken her life in a moment of carelessness, and now he was damned. There would be no redemption, no forgiveness. This was his eternity, an endless cycle of torment, reliving his sin, his guilt over and over again. The creature raised its massive hand, its claws gleaming in the dim light of the chamber. John didn't resist this time. He didn't fight or struggle. He couldn't. The guilt was too much to bear, and he knew he deserved whatever punishment was coming. The creature's claws descended, slicing through the air with a sound like a whip crack. John braced himself for the pain, the agony that he knew was coming. But as the claws reached him, there was no pain, no physical sensation at all. Instead, his mind exploded with memories, every detail of the accident, every moment of that night, playing out in excruciating detail. The screams, her screams and his. The guilt washed over him in waves, drowning him in despair. He couldn't escape it, couldn't hide from it. It was all-consuming, suffocating, and there was no end in sight. When the memories finally subsided, John found himself back on the cold, rough stone floor, curled up in a ball, shaking uncontrollably. The creature was gone, the chamber was silent, but the guilt remained, gnawing at him like a ravenous beast. He knew now that this was his hell, an endless cycle of torment, reliving the worst moment of his life, the moment of his greatest sin, over and over again. There would be no escape, no reprieve. He was trapped here, in this nightmarish landscape forever. And as the darkness closed in around him once more, as the oppressive silence pressed down on him from all sides, John realized that this was only the beginning. The cycle would start again, and he would wake up, once more, in the cold, rough stone, with no memory of what had come before. He would rise, he would walk toward the glow, and he would relive the nightmare all over again, forever. The realization broke him, and as his sanity unraveled, John's screams joined the chorus of the damned, echoing through the endless void of hell. It started with the smell of smoke. People in Timber Grove, a sleepy town nestled deep within the forests of the Pacific Northwest, were used to the sight of wood smoke spiraling up from chimneys on cold mornings. But this smell wasn't wood. It was acrid, sharp, and it lingered in the air like a warning. One morning in early October, the town's usual peacefulness was shattered when 8-year-old Sophie Granger disappeared on her way to school. Her mother, Rachel, reported that Sophie had left the house around 7:45 a.m., just like every other day. The sun was low, casting a foggy glow over the town. Sophie never made it to the schoolhouse. The sheriff, Walter Hayes, led the search, organizing a small army of volunteers. Timber Grove was tight-knit, the kind of place where everyone knew each other. They combed through the surrounding woods, retraced Sophie's steps, and questioned everyone in town, but no one had seen a thing. It was as though the girl had evaporated into the mist. The community was rattled. For the first time in decades, the sense of safety that Timber Grove prided itself on was shattered. Whispers began circulating through the town, talk of strangers, of dark cars lurking at the edge of town, of someone watching the children. There had to be an explanation. Someone must be responsible. Then another child vanished. This time it was Tommy Harris, a 10-year-old boy. He had been playing outside just before dusk, chasing his dog through the trees behind his home. His mother had called for him when dinner was ready, but Tommy never returned. His dog, however, came sprinting back, yelping, its fur singed in patches as if it had run through fire. The town's panic intensified. Something or someone was taking their children, and whatever it was doing so with chilling precision. Sheriff Hayes doubled down on his efforts. He imposed a curfew, ordered searches of every home, and even brought in state police to assist with the investigation. The woods were scoured again, and this time they found something. Deep in the forest, where the trees grew so dense that sunlight barely touched the ground, they came upon a circle of scorched earth. The grass and underbrush had been seared away, leaving behind a strange blackened patch of soil. There was no explanation for it. No lightning storms, no fires, nothing that should have caused such destruction. A rumor started among the search parties. Whoever was taking the children was using fire to cover their tracks. Maybe some deranged drifter was out there, hiding in the woods, taking kids and burning their bodies to destroy the evidence. It was the only explanation that made sense to them. Rachel Granger, still grieving the loss of Sophie, grew more paranoid by the day. She began seeing shadows outside her window at night, strange flickers of light in the trees. Her husband, Mark, dismissed it as stress. But Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her, waiting. 3 weeks after Tommy's disappearance, another child went missing, this time 12-year-old Emily Weaver. Her father, George, a local fisherman, swore he had only taken his eyes off her for a few minutes. She had been sitting on the porch doing her homework. When he returned from the kitchen, the chair was empty. The only sign of her was her backpack, lying in the dirt, its straps singed. Sheriff Hayes called an emergency town meeting. The town hall was packed, the air thick with fear and desperation. Some parents began blaming each other, convinced that someone in Timber Grove was behind the abductions. Others pointed fingers at the outsiders who occasionally passed through, the drifters and hikers who ventured into the woods. Rachel, sitting near the back, noticed something strange as she listened to the frantic voices. She had seen the singed grass, the burnt fur on Tommy's dog, and now Emily's scorched backpack. This wasn't fire, she realized. It was something else, something much worse. As the meeting raged on, a storm rolled in, dark clouds gathering above the town, blotting out the moon. The first crack of thunder silenced the room, and moments later the power went out. The hall was plunged into darkness, save for the occasional flicker of lightning that illuminated the windows. In the chaos, Rachel slipped outside. She needed to clear her head, to think. The storm was fierce, rain slashing down, wind howling through the trees. She found herself walking toward the forest without realizing it, drawn by some instinct. Maybe it was grief, or maybe it was something deeper, something pulling her toward the truth. As she approached the tree line, a bright light pierced the darkness ahead. It wasn't lightning, it was steady, unnatural, hovering just above the ground. Rachel froze, her heart pounding in her chest. The light grew brighter, and she saw them. Figures. They were tall, impossibly tall, with elongated limbs and large, dark eyes that glistened in the light. Their skin was pale and smooth, almost translucent, and they moved with an eerie fluidity, as though gravity didn't quite affect them the way it did her. Rachel wanted to scream, but no sound came. She watched in horror as one of the creatures bent down, lifting something from the ground. A child, Emily Weaver, limp and unconscious, being cradled in the creature's arms. The light intensified, and Rachel was blinded. When she could see again, they were gone, vanished into the night, leaving only the scorched earth behind. Rachel ran back to town, soaking wet and shaking, but no one believed her. The sheriff dismissed her story as hysteria, the ravings of a mother broken by grief. Even Mark, her husband, tried to comfort her, telling her it was all in her head. But Rachel knew the truth. Whatever was taking the children wasn't human. It wasn't some drifter or lunatic hiding in the woods. It was something else, something from beyond the stars. She wasn't the only one who suspected the truth, though. A few other parents began noticing strange things, flickers of light in the night sky, odd electrical disturbances, and that pervasive, acrid smell that always lingered in the air after each disappearance. Rachel tried to warn the town, but it was too late. The abductions continued. One by one, the children of Timber Grove vanished, always without a trace, always with that same sickening scorch Mark left behind. The final blow came on a bitterly cold November night. Rachel and Mark were fast asleep when they were awoken by a loud hum, an unnatural vibrating noise that seemed to come from everywhere at once. They rushed to Sophie's room, but it was empty. Rachel screamed, falling to her knees as the realization hit her. Sophie was gone, taken like the others. Mark stood in the doorway, frozen in place. His eyes, wide with disbelief, were fixed on the window. Rachel followed his gaze and saw it. Outside, hovering just above the trees, was a massive, silent ship. Its surface shimmered with an otherworldly glow, lights pulsing in strange rhythmic patterns. For a moment, Rachel thought she could see the silhouettes of the children, dozens of them, standing inside the ship, looking down at the town below. And then, in an instant, the ship vanished into the night sky, leaving nothing behind but a faint smell of smoke and the cold, empty silence. By spring, Timber Grove was a ghost town. The few remaining families packed up and left, unwilling to risk the same fate for their children. The state police closed the investigation, ruling it a series of tragic kidnappings with no leads. No bodies were ever found. No suspects ever charged. Rachel remained, though. She couldn't leave. She spent her days wandering the empty streets, staring up at the sky, waiting for the lights to return, waiting for Sophie. And every night, without fail, she saw them, the flickers in the sky, the strange shapes moving just beyond the clouds. Rachel knew they would come back. They always did. When the Davis family moved into the old house at the edge of town, they had no idea what lay in wait. It was the kind of house that had stood for decades, its windows sagging slightly, its roof weathered and brittle. Yet, to the Davis family, it was a fresh start. After all, it was affordable, and they were desperate for a new beginning. Jacob, 10, and his younger sister Lily, 8, were more curious than scared. The house had character, as their father called it. Each room was a puzzle of faded wallpaper and creaky floorboards, and the grand attic loomed above them like an invitation to explore. It was the attic they were drawn to most of all. Their mother had asked them not to play up there until it was cleared out, but that only made them more eager. One rainy afternoon, while their parents were busy unpacking, Jacob nudged Lily, a glint of mischief in his eyes. "Let's check it out. They won't even notice," he said. Lily hesitated, biting her lip, but curiosity got the better of her. With Jacob leading the way, they crept up the narrow staircase, the old wood groaning beneath their feet. At the top, the door to the attic was slightly ajar, as if it had been waiting for them. The air was cooler up there, and it smelled of dust and something older, something Lily couldn't quite place. The light barely reached the edges of the room, casting long shadows that seemed to shift in the dimness. Boxes and old furniture were piled in corners, forgotten relics of another time. "What do you think is in all this stuff?" Jacob whispered, his voice breaking the stillness. Lily shrugged, her eyes drawn to a large chest near the far wall. Unlike the other items, it seemed out of place, the wood still intact and the brass locks shining, almost as though it had been polished recently. I bet there's something cool in there, Jacob said, already making his way over. The chest was heavy, but with both of them tugging at the lid, it eventually gave way with a creak. Inside there were old clothes, dusty books, and then, at the very bottom, something that made Lily's breath catch. It was a ventriloquist doll. It lay there, still and silent, its painted eyes staring up at them. The doll was dressed in a small black suit, its wooden face frozen in a wide, unsettling grin. Its hair was made of brittle black threads, and its hands, though small, were unnervingly detailed. Lily's stomach turned at the sight of it. "Jacob, I don't like it. Let's put it back." But Jacob's curiosity had taken hold. He reached down and lifted the doll from the chest, his fingers brushing against the cool wood of its body. It felt heavy in his hands, more substantial than he'd expected. "Nah, it's just a doll, see?" He made its head nod and its mouth clack open and shut, mimicking a deep cartoonish voice. "Hello, Lily. Nice to meet you." "Stop it," Lily snapped, stepping back, her face pale. "It's creepy." Jacob laughed, but there was something forced in it. The doll's eyes seemed to follow Lily wherever she moved, its lifeless grin almost mocking. Reluctantly, he placed the doll back in the chest, closing the lid. They didn't speak about the doll for the rest of the day, though Lily couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching her even now, hidden away. That night, as she lay in bed, she thought she heard faint creaking sounds from the attic above them, but she told herself it was just the house settling. The next day, the rain persisted. Jacob seemed distracted at breakfast, his eyes darting toward the ceiling as if the attic was calling to him. When their parents left to run errands, it didn't take long for him to convince Lily to return. As they climbed the stairs, an uneasy silence fell over the house. When they reached the attic, Jacob hesitated, his hand on the door. "Are you scared?" Lily whispered. He shook his head, but she noticed his hand trembled as he pushed the door open. The chest was still there, of course, and so was the doll. Only now, it was sitting upright on top of the chest, its grin wider than before. Lily gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Jacob, how did—" Jacob frowned, stepping closer, his eyes narrowing. "I didn't do that." He approached the doll cautiously, as if expecting it to move on its own. When he picked it up, the air in the attic seemed to grow colder, pressing against their skin like icy fingers. "I want to leave," Lily whispered, her voice trembling. But Jacob didn't listen. He was staring into the doll's eyes, his expression growing distant. The doll's mouth hung open, revealing the small, hinged mechanism inside. "Look at this," Jacob murmured, moving its mouth up and down. But something wasn't right. The more he played with it, the more the room seemed to shift. The shadows lengthened, creeping up the walls like dark tendrils. Lily backed away, her heart pounding in her chest. "Jacob, put it down," she cried, her voice shrill. But Jacob didn't move. His hand gripped the doll tighter, his face slack. Then, without warning, he started laughing. It was a strange, hollow sound, one that sent chills down Lily's spine. The doll's eyes gleamed in the dim light, its grin almost predatory. "Jacob, stop!" she screamed, but it was as if he couldn't hear her. His laughter grew louder, more manic, echoing through the attic in jagged bursts. Panicking, Lily lunged forward and grabbed the doll, yanking it out of Jacob's hands. The moment it left his grip, his laughter ceased, and he slumped to the floor, gasping for breath. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Lily stared down at the doll, horrified. In the silence, she swore she heard a faint whisper, a voice that wasn't her brother's. That night, Lily couldn't sleep. Every creak and groan of the house made her jump, her mind racing with thoughts of the doll. Jacob hadn't said much after they came down from the attic. He'd been pale, withdrawn, but their parents didn't seem to notice anything wrong. Sometime after midnight, a soft sound reached her ears, like someone whispering her name. Lily. She sat up in bed, her heart pounding. The room was dark, the only light a sliver of moon through the curtains. But there, in the corner, she saw it. The doll. It was sitting on the floor, its wooden legs splayed awkwardly, its painted grin somehow wider than before. Lily froze, terror gripping her. She hadn't brought the doll downstairs, she hadn't touched it since the attic. How had it gotten here? Slowly it began to move. Its head jerked to the side, its eyes locking onto hers. Then its mouth opened with a sickening creak. Lily. "Come play with me," it rasped in a voice that wasn't quite human. Lily screamed, leaping from her bed and bolting from the room. She ran to Jacob's door, pounding on it frantically. When he didn't answer, she threw the door open. Jacob was sitting on the floor, the doll in his lap. His eyes were vacant, staring ahead, and his lips moved in sync with the doll's. "Lily, come play with Mum." Her brother's voice was flat, emotionless, as though he was no longer in control of it. "Jacob, stop it!" Lily cried, rushing toward him. But he didn't respond. The doll's head turned toward her, its lifeless eyes gleaming in the dark. "You can't leave, Lily. You belong to me now," it whispered, though its wooden lips didn't move. Lily backed away, tears streaming down her face. She turned to run, but the door slammed shut before she could reach it. The doll's laughter filled the room, and as she looked back, she saw her brother's eyes roll back into his head. His body went limp, collapsing to the floor, leaving only the doll standing. And then the doll spoke again, in a voice that was both Jacob's and something far darker. "Don't worry, Lily. We'll be together, forever." The last thing Lily saw was the doll's smile, stretching wider and wider, swallowing the room in darkness. When their parents returned, the house was silent. They called for Jacob and Lily, but there was no answer. Upstairs, the attic door stood open, and inside they found the chest, lit askew, the doll resting on top. Its eyes seemed to sparkle in the dim light, and from somewhere deep within the house, a faint echo of laughter lingered, soft, hollow, and cruel. Thank you for joining me this evening. Before you go, make sure you subscribe and leave a like. If you have an idea for a short, scary story, leave it in the comments below. See you at the next campfire.